Alright, let's get into it. Number 10. The Battle of Marathon. On a September morning in 490 BC, on the flat coastal plain northeast of Athens, a Greek force of approximately 10,000 hoplites stood facing the full weight of the Persian Empire. The commanders were Miltiades for the Greeks, and the Persian generals Datis and Artaphernes, men who had crossed the Aegean with an army of perhaps 25,000 soldiers, confident that this small city-state would be crushed before midday. The battle that followed became one of the most celebrated military victories in human history. But buried inside that celebrated story is something Herodotus recorded and never dismissed, something that soldiers on the plain described when the fighting was over. They had seen a figure, not a man among the ranks, not a commander on horseback, but a giant running across the plain in the thick of the fighting, enormous and luminous, charging toward the Persian line as though the earth itself had sent a champion. Greek soldiers identified the figure as Theseus, the legendary founder king of Athens, the hero who had built the city they were dying to defend. The sighting was not a whispered rumor. It was recorded by Herodotus, the most methodical historian of the ancient world, a man who verified his sources and noted when he doubted them. He did not doubt this. To understand why this account carries weight, you have to understand the context of Marathon. The Persian Wars were not merely military conflicts. They were existential confrontations, clashes between two entirely different visions of how human civilization should be ordered. Athens in 490 BC was a young democracy, barely 20 years old, surrounded by enemies and now facing the largest military power on earth. The Athenian soldiers who assembled on the plain of Marathon were citizen soldiers, men with farms and families, who understood that if they failed, Athens would burn and its people would be enslaved or killed. Miltiades made the audacious decision to attack, running his hoplites forward at speed across the plain to close the distance before Persian archers could devastate them. The tactic worked. The Persian force broke and fled to its ships, leaving 6,400 of their dead on the sand, a number Herodotus recorded with precision. The Greeks lost exactly 192 men, also precisely recorded, because each one was buried in a communal tomb, the Soros, a burial mound that still rises from the plain of Marathon today, visible to any visitor who makes the journey. The exactness of those casualty figures is important. This is a battle documented with unusual rigor for the ancient world. It is within that rigorously documented battle that the phantom appears. Herodotus records the sighting in his Histories Book 6 without qualification or skepticism. Pausanias, writing his description of Greece roughly 600 years after the battle, adds something that deepens the strangeness considerably. By his time, local people living near the plain reported still hearing the sounds of the battle at night, the clash of weapons and the neighing of horses, and still seeing the figure of a great man running across the ground where the dead had fallen. The sighting had not faded with the century, it had apparently continued. What makes the Marathon account particularly compelling within the context of this list is its effect on the Persian side. Herodotus does not record Persian testimony because no Persian chronicler of this battle survives. But the Persian army's collapse was so sudden and so complete, in circumstances where they retained numerical superiority and should have been able to regroup, that Greek veterans consistently attributed the rout to more than military tactics. Something had broken the Persians. Something beyond the discipline of Miltiades had sent them running for their ships without the organized retreat that a professional imperial army should have managed. Scholars have offered explanations for the phantom sighting over the centuries. Mass suggestion under extreme combat stress is the most common. The human mind under mortal fear is capable of projecting shapes onto the landscape, particularly when the culture already expects divine intervention on a sacred day. Marathon was fought, Greek sources agree, on a day of deep religious significance. The soldiers were primed, culturally and psychologically, to perceive the presence of the heroic dead. These are serious arguments, and any honest account of this story has to include them. But they do not fully account for Pausanias. 600 years after Marathon, with no soldiers left to experience combat stress, with the cultural urgency of the battle long dissolved into mythology, Local people who had no particular reason to maintain a self-serving story were still reporting the sounds and the figure. The Soros was there, the bones were there, and, according to Pausanias, so was something else. Something that kept returning to the place where 192 men had been buried, as though the plane had not quite finished with what happened there. The Soros still stands. You can visit it, you can walk the ground where the 10,000 ran and the 6,400 fell. The topography is exactly as described, the same flat coastal plain, the same hills behind, the same sea in front. Everything that Herodotus recorded about the physical reality of Marathon has been confirmed by archaeology. The burial mound is real. The bones inside it are real. The battle was exactly as documented. And inside that precisely documented, archaeologically verified event, there's a figure that no physical evidence has ever accounted for, seen by Greek soldiers in the moment of crisis, and reported by local witnesses for centuries afterward. The mound of the Athenian dead still rises from the plain of Marathon. 2,500 years of weather and scholarship have not flattened it, and they have not explained what ran alongside those soldiers on the day they saved their city. Whatever it was, Herodotus thought it worth recording. Pausanias thought it worth verifying. And the ground itself, with its ancient bones and its enduring mound, gives the story a weight that pure legend rarely carries. Some things refuse to stay buried, even when the burial is real. Number 9. The Battle of Salamis. On a September morning in 480 BC, Xerxes the Fens, king of kings, ruler of the Persian Empire, took his seat on a golden throne placed on a hillside above the Straits of Salamis to watch his navy destroy the Greek fleet. He had brought scribes with him to record the names of his commanders who performed best in battle, because he expected a comprehensive victory. What he witnessed instead was the most catastrophic naval defeat in Persian history. And what both his sailors and the Greeks described happening during that battle, recorded by Herodotus within living memory of the survivors, remains without any comfortable explanation. Herodotus, in Book 8 of his Histories, records a phenomenon that occurred as the two fleets engaged in the narrow straits. A great voice was heard across the water, described as a shout so powerful it seemed to come from the land itself rather than any human throat. A light appeared, visible to sailors on both sides of the engagement, eerie and luminous in a way that witnesses struggled to articulate clearly but agreed upon consistently. Greek sailors identified what they perceived as a divine presence, some describing it as the goddess Athena, others as a herald of the gods. The Persians, from their position, experienced something that contributed to the breaking of their formation at a critical moment. To understand the significance of Salamis, you need to understand the state of Greece in 480 BC. Xerxes had crossed into Europe with an army ancient sources estimated at over 1 million men, a figure modern historians revise downward to perhaps 200,000 to 300,000, still the largest force ever assembled in the ancient world to that point. Athens had already been abandoned and burned. The Acropolis was in ruins. The Persian army had swept through northern and central Greece almost without resistance, and the Greek alliance was fracturing under the pressure of imminent annihilation. Salamis was not a battle Greece expected to win. The Greek fleet numbered approximately 370 triremes, commanded by the Athenian general Themistocles. The Persian fleet is estimated by Herodotus at over 1,200 ships, though modern scholarship places the realistic figure closer to 600 to 800. Either way, the Greeks were heavily outnumbered in open water. Themistocles engineered a strategic trap drawing the Persian fleet into the narrow straits, where their numerical advantage would become a liability rather than a strength. The tactic was brilliant. But what happened in those straits, according to every contemporary account that survives, was not reducible entirely to Themistocles' tactical brilliance. At a crucial point in the engagement, something disrupted the Persian formation in a way that ancient sources attribute to more than the geography of the straits. Herodotus describes the voice and the light with the specificity of a man relaying eyewitness testimony rather than composing mythology. Aeschylus, the playwright who wrote The Persians just 8 years after the battle, performed it before an Athenian audience that included veterans of Salamis, men who had been in the water that day. His play depicts the battle with the kind of detail that could not have been fabricated in front of survivors without causing outrage. He includes the inexplicable. The phenomenon at Salamis belongs to a category of battle events that historians call contested, meaning the facts of what occurred are not in question, but the cause remains unresolved. Something was seen and heard in the Straits of Salamis on that September morning. Both Greek and Persian accounts filtered through Herodotus agree on this. The disagreement is entirely about origin and nature. The Greeks attributed it to their gods. The Persians, in the accounts Herodotus gathered from both sides of the conflict, had no comparable theological framework to contain what they experienced, which may be why their accounts are more disjointed and harder to categorize. Xerxes watched the entire battle from his hillside throne. He was positioned with his scribes in his court specifically to observe and to record. If a luminous phenomenon was visible to sailors in the straits below him, he would have seen it from his elevated vantage point. Herodotus does not record Xerxes' personal reaction to whatever light appeared, but he records the king's response to the battle's outcome with pointed detail. Xerxes began planning his retreat from Greece within hours of the defeat. A man who had come to conquer a continent turned around and went home after a single naval battle. The rational explanations for the Salamis phenomenon focus on atmospheric conditions in the straits, the angle of the early morning light across the water, and the ancient tendency to interpret any unusual natural occurrence as divine communication. These are credible arguments. The Straits of Salamis are geographically unusual, a narrow channel between the island and the mainland that creates its own wind patterns and reflective surfaces. September light in the Aegean can produce striking optical effects. An army primed by its own religious tradition to expect divine assistance would be strongly predisposed to interpret an unusual light as exactly that. What the rational explanations cannot fully address is the convergence of accounts. Herodotus gathered testimony from both Greek and Persian survivors, men with opposing religious frameworks, and no incentive to agree on anything. They agreed that something anomalous happened in the straits at the moment of crisis. The causes they attributed to it were different, but the core observation was the same. Aeschylus, performing his account before survivors, did not omit it. The Society of Athens, which awarded prizes for dramatic achievement, did not find the inclusion implausible. The audience knew what had been there. When Aeschylus staged the Persians in 472 BC, 8 years after the battle, men who had gripped their oars in those straits were sitting in the audience. Veterans who had heard the voice across the water, who had seen the light, were present in the theater as the account was performed before them. Aeschylus had also been at Salamis. He did not write the phenomenon out of his account. Neither did Herodotus. Neither has any archaeologist or historian who has subsequently studied the battle in its full context managed to produce an explanation for what those men on both sides of the water agreed they experienced. Number 8. The Battle of Frigidus. On September 5th, 394 AD, two Roman armies faced each other across the Frigidus River in a narrow alpine valley on the border of what is now Slovenia and Italy. One army fought under the banner of the Christian god, commanded by Emperor Theodosius III. The other carried the old Roman standards of Jupiter and Hercules, fighting for the usurper Eugenius and his general Arbogast, pagans defending the ancient religion of Rome against a Christianity that now controlled the empire. This was not merely a battle, it was a confrontation between two worlds, and what happened on the second day was witnessed by soldiers on both sides and recorded by rioters from both faiths. On day 1, Theodosius suffered catastrophic losses. His Gothic Federate troops, the allied warriors who formed the core of his assault force, took the brunt of the fighting and were slaughtered in enormous numbers. The historian Zosimus, writing from a pagan perspective sympathetic to Eugenius, records approximately 10,000 Gothic dead on the first day alone. Theodosius's army was badly mauled, his assault had failed, and by nightfall his position appeared desperate. Eugenius's forces held the river crossing with confidence. The next morning, when Theodosius prayed through the night and renewed his assault, something extraordinary intervened, and what is remarkable is the sources who recorded it. The Roman world of 394 AD was acutely aware of the distinction between the old religion and the new. Paganism had deep roots in the aristocracy and the military, and its defenders were not superstitious peasants, but educated men of the empire's governing class. The Bishop of Milan, Ambrose, was a sophisticated political operator and theologian. Claudian, the greatest Latin poet of the late 4th century, was an intellectual who wrote in the classical tradition and held no particular attachment to Christian theology. Rufinus of Aquileia was a Christian monk and historian. These men disagreed about almost everything. They did not disagree about what happened at the Frigidus River on September 6th. A violent wind struck the army of Eugenius, not a breeze, not a seasonal gust, but a sustained and ferocious bora. The northeastern wind that the geography of the Vipava Valley is capable of producing with devastating force, driving directly into the faces of Eugenius's soldiers. The wind was so powerful that it drove their own missiles back upon them, turned their shields into sails that dragged them backward, blinded them with dust, and made coordinated fighting nearly impossible. Theodosius's army, positioned behind the wind, was sheltered from its effects. The timing was precise to the point of seeming intentional. Ambrose of Milan wrote about the wind in a letter composed shortly after the battle, attributing it explicitly to divine intervention on behalf of the Christian emperor. This is expected. Ambrose was Theodosius's ecclesiastical ally and had every theological and political motivation to present the wind as a miracle. His account alone would carry limited evidential weight. But Claudian also wrote about it. In his poem De Terrio Consulatu Honori, composed to celebrate Theodosius's dynasty, Claudian, a pagan with no theological stake in Christian triumphalism, describes the wind as decisive and as something that cannot be attributed simply to weather. He was writing about what he understood to be a real event. Rufinus of Aquileia records it. Augustine of Hippo, writing decades later in The City of God, references the battle's miraculous character. What is striking about this convergence is not that Christian writers celebrated a Christian emperor's victory as divinely ordained, which is entirely unremarkable, but that Claudian, a pagan intellectual writing within the classical literary tradition, confirms the extraordinary nature of the wind without attributing it to the Christian God. He records the phenomenon. He simply does not offer an alternative explanation. The wind happened. The timing was what it was. He leaves the interpretation unspoken. The meteorological explanation for the Frigidus Bora is well established. The Vipava Valley is one of the most consistent Bora corridors in the Eastern Alps, a geographic funnel through which Arctic air from the north drives southward with exceptional force. Bora winds in this region have been recorded at over 200 kilometers per hour in modern measurements, sufficient to knock people off their feet and make organized military movement impossible. The conditions on September 6, 394 AD could certainly have produced exactly the kind of wind that Ambrose and Claudian describe. The meteorology is not in question. What resists the purely meteorological explanation is the directionality and the timing. A Bora wind in the Vipava Valley is a regional phenomenon affecting the entire corridor, not a force that can be surgically directed at one army and not the other based on their position at the river crossing. Theodosius's forces, advancing into the same valley, should have encountered the same wind from the same direction. The accounts, across all sources, Christian and pagan alike, agree that the wind struck Eugenius's army and not Theodosius's. If this is accurate, the geography of the battle positions at the Frigidus crossing would need to account for the differential effect in ways that scholars have debated ever since. The consequences of the battle were civilizational. Eugenius was captured and executed. Arbogast fled into the mountains and died by suicide. Theodosius reunited the empire under Christian rule for the final time, and within months he was dead, leaving his sons to divide it permanently. The Battle of Frigidus is, by any measure, one of the most consequential engagements in Roman history. It ended paganism as Rome's official faith. It confirmed the dynasty that would rule the fragmented empire's successor states for generations. It was witnessed by educated men who wrote about it immediately from opposing perspectives and agreed on the central unexplained fact. Claudian was a pagan. He had read the Greek and Roman philosophers. He understood natural causation, and he understood the difference between meteorology and miracle. He had every intellectual and rhetorical reason to attribute the wind at Frigidus to atmospheric conditions, to reduce it to geography, to deny it the weight that Ambrose was already placing upon it. Instead, he wrote that the wind fought for Theodosius, and he left the reason unspoken. That silence, from the finest Latin mind of the late Roman world, is its own kind of testimony. Number 7. The Battle of Leipzig. On October 18, 1813, the largest battle ever fought in European history reached its terrible climax in the fields and streets surrounding the Saxon city of Leipzig. Approximately 600,000 soldiers from more than a dozen nations, French, Russian, Prussian, Austrian, Swedish, Saxon, and others, were engaged across a front that stretched for kilometers in every direction. Artillery fire was continuous. Casualties on that single day numbered in the tens of thousands. And in the smoke and chaos above the battlefield, soldiers from at least 3 different national armies, men who did not share a language, a religion, or a chain of command, looked up and described the same thing. The accounts were collected in the years and decades following the battle, drawn from regimental journals, personal letters, and the testimonies of surviving veterans compiled by German military historians of the 19th century. What they describe, with a consistency that cuts across national origin and individual circumstance, is the appearance of figures in the sky above the battlefield. Mounted warriors silhouetted against the smoke and clouds, visible for sustained periods during the fighting on October 18th. Not glimpsed in a moment of panic and forgotten. Described in writing with the deliberate, sober language of men who had survived 4 days of industrialized slaughter and were attempting to account honestly for what they had experienced. To understand why Leipzig matters as a battle, you need to understand what was at stake in October 1813. Napoleon Bonaparte had dominated European politics and warfare for nearly 2 decades. His Grande Armée had marched to Moscow and returned in ruins. The catastrophic Russian campaign of 1812 had broken his strategic position, and now the nations of Europe had assembled against him in an alliance unprecedented in its scale and coordination. The Battle of Leipzig, which its survivors called the Völkerschlacht, the Battle of Nations, was the engagement that would determine whether Napoleon could survive as a European power or whether his empire would collapse. Napoleon commanded roughly 195,000 French and Allied troops. Facing him was a coalition force that grew during the battle itself as additional armies arrived, eventually reaching approximately 380,000 men. 4 days of fighting produced around 100,000 casualties on all sides, figures that make Leipzig the bloodiest battle in European history before the First World War. The soldiers engaged at Leipzig were not raw recruits or superstitious peasants. The Prussian officer corps was among the most professionally educated in Europe. Russian noblemen serving as officers maintained journals and wrote detailed letters. French veterans had campaigned across a continent. These were literate, experienced, and, in many cases, philosophically sophisticated men. The phenomenon they described belongs to a documented category of atmospheric optical events. A fata morgana is a complex form of mirage produced when layers of air at different temperatures refract light in ways that create floating, almost inverted, or duplicated images of objects on or near the horizon. In conditions of smoke, dust, and extreme temperature variation produced by large-scale artillery fire, the optical environment above a major battlefield is unlike almost any other natural setting. Researchers studying historical battle accounts have identified what appear to be fata morgana events at several major engagements where observers described objects or figures in the sky that subsequent analysis suggests were distorted reflections of things on the ground. The Leipzig accounts resist a simple Fata Morgana explanation for one specific reason. A Fata Morgana event is determined by atmospheric conditions, not by the position of the observer. If the conditions above Leipzig on October 18th produced sky figures visible to Prussian soldiers northeast of the city, those same conditions should have produced the same images for French soldiers to the west and Russian troops to the south. The accounts from different national positions do not describe the same images in the same location in the sky. They describe similar figures, mounted and watching, but positioned above the sector of the battlefield, visible from their respective vantage points. This localization is difficult to account for through standard atmospheric optics. Johann Friedrich Benzenberg, a German astronomer and meteorologist who was active in this period and wrote extensively about atmospheric phenomena in the Rhine and Saxon regions, noted in his correspondence that the weather conditions of mid-October 1813 in Saxony were unusual, with temperature inversions and persistent smoke from agricultural burning combining with battlefield artillery emissions to create atmospheric conditions he described as unlike any he had previously recorded. Benzenberg was not making a supernatural claim. He was recording an anomaly in the physical environment. But his observation that the atmosphere above Leipzig in those days was genuinely unusual provides a context that makes the soldiers' accounts harder to dismiss as pure imagination. What distinguishes the Leipzig accounts from ordinary battle mythology is the specificity and independence of the sources. Men who had no contact with each other, who were separated by kilometers of active battlefield, who wrote in different languages for different audiences, described the same basic phenomenon without any mechanism by which their accounts could have been coordinated or contaminated. A Prussian officer writing in German in a regimental journal, a Russian nobleman composing a letter to his family in French, a French veteran dictating his memoirs years later in Paris, they did not read each other's accounts. They recorded what they saw independently, and what they saw was convergent. The battle ended with Napoleon's defeat and the destruction of his hold on Germany. Within 6 months, he would abdicate and go into exile. Leipzig was the hinge on which the modern map of Europe turned. The men who fought there had participated in one of history's decisive moments, and they knew it, which is why so many of them wrote about it so carefully and at such length. Their accounts of the sky above Leipzig on October 18th are embedded in documents of unimpeachable historical seriousness, written by men whose other observations about the battle have been confirmed in every verifiable particular. When 500,000 soldiers are dying in a valley and veterans from 3 separate nations independently describe the same figures watching from the clouds above them, the question of what they saw demands something more than a dismissive answer. The Fata Morgana explanation is plausible. The combat stress explanation is reasonable. But neither accounts for the localization of the phenomenon to each observer's own sector, nor for the sustained duration of the sightings across hours of fighting. Something was in the sky above Leipzig on October 18, 1813. The men who looked up and wrote about it deserved a better answer than they ever received. Number 6. The Battle of Edgehill. On October 23, 1642, at a field near the village of Kinneton in Warwickshire, the first major pitched battle of the English Civil War was fought between the royalist army of King Charles I, commanded by Prince Rupert of the Rhine, and the parliamentary force of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Several hundred men died on that field before darkness ended the fighting. Neither side could claim a decisive victory. The armies withdrew, leaving their dead in the ground, and the civil war that would consume England for the next 9 years continued its course. But Edgehill was not finished with the living, not by a long way. In December 1642, less than 2 months after the battle, a shepherd named William Wood was crossing the fields near Kinneton late one night when he heard drums, then trumpets, then the sounds of cavalry and artillery. He looked across the field and saw, in the sky above the place where the dead were buried, the Battle of Edgehill being fought again. Soldiers in formation, cavalry charges, the flash of weapons, the full noise and visual spectacle of the engagement, replaying across the sky as though the October afternoon had somehow become caught in that ground. Wood ran. He found neighbors and brought them back. They saw it too. For several nights, in late December 1642, multiple witnesses observed the same phenomenon. The English Civil War was, in many respects, a highly literate conflict. Both sides maintained elaborate paper trails, pamphlets, sermons, newsbooks, petitions, and parliamentary records document the period in extraordinary detail. When the Edgehill apparition became known in London, it attracted the kind of attention that the contemporary information ecosystem was capable of sustaining. A pamphlet titled A Great Wonder in Heaven was printed in January 1643, within weeks of the events, while all the witnesses were alive and their accounts were fresh and verifiable. The pamphlet named the initial witnesses, described the phenomenon in specific detail, and noted that the apparitions had been observed on multiple separate nights. What elevated the Edgehill account beyond the level of ordinary folklore was what happened next. King Charles VI, residing at Oxford, received reports of the phenomenon and responded not with dismissal, but with investigation. He sent a commission of officers to Kyneton, men with military reputations and professional credibility, to determine what was occurring. The commission included Colonel Lewis Kirk, Captain Dudley, Captain Wayman, and several other named officers. They arrived at Edgehill expecting to find exaggeration or rural superstition. What they found, according to the pamphlet's account and subsequent corroborating documents, was the apparition itself. The officers witnessed the phantom battle. According to the pamphlets, which drew on their accounts, they watched the spectral engagement for a sustained period, observing formations, hearing sounds, and recognizing within the phantom army the faces of specific men who had died in the actual battle 2 months earlier. This is the detail that separates Edgehill from almost every comparable account. These were not frightened villagers seeing shapes in the dark. These were professional military men sent specifically to debunk a rumor, who instead returned to King Charles with signed confirmations of what they had seen and the names of the dead they had recognized. The rational explanations for Edgehill focus on collective psychology in a traumatized rural community in the first weeks of a civil war, on the atmospheric conditions of the English winter nights, and on the possibility that the pamphlet itself, being a commercial publication in a market that rewarded sensationalism, amplified and perhaps embellished accounts that had more prosaic origins. These are reasonable cautions. The pamphlet, A Great Wonder in Heaven, was not a government document or a sworn legal deposition. It was a printed account in a medium that had commercial incentives to dramatize its content. The historian must approach it with appropriate skepticism, but the officer's investigation is harder to dismiss. Colonel Kirka and his colleagues were not local villagers. They were professional soldiers operating within a military command structure that valued practical judgment and clear reporting. They had been sent by the king specifically to resolve a question, which means their professional credibility was attached to the accuracy of their findings. Men in that position do not typically return from an investigation claiming to have witnessed supernatural events unless they believe they have something genuine to report. The social and professional cost of fabricating such an account in January 1643 would have been considerable. The English Civil War produced an extensive literature of wonder, an outpouring of pamphlets recording prodigies, portents, and unexplained events that contemporaries read as divine commentary on the conflict. Edgehill sits within this literature, which means it shares a cultural context that predisposed both witnesses and readers to find supernatural significance in the dead are still there, and the question of what Colonel Kirky and his commission witnessed in the December darkness 2 months after a battle that neither side won has not been resolved in the nearly 4 centuries since they filed their report. Number 5. The Battle of Gettysburg. On July 2nd, 1863, the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment stood on the southern slope of a hill called Little Round Top and understood that his position was the end of the entire Union. He described, in language he never made fully explicit, a presence on that hill. The fighting at Gettysburg over 3 days in July 1863 produced approximately 51,000 casualties, making it the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. The Union suffered around 23,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Confederate losses approached 28,000. The scale of the killing was unlike anything the American continent had previously experienced, and it occurred in a landscape of farms and fields and hills whose names became permanent in American memory. Little Round Top, Cemetery Ridge, the Peach Orchard, Devil's Den. These were ordinary places made extraordinary by what happened in them over 3 days in the summer of 1863. The ground absorbed something in those 3 days that it apparently did not release easily. Chamberlain was not alone in his oblique references. Union soldiers in multiple regiments, their accounts collected by John Batchelder, the Gettysburg battlefield historian, who conducted systematic interviews with veterans between 1863 and 1880, describe something similar. The Batchelder papers, now held in the collections of the New Hampshire Historical Society, represent the most comprehensive collection of first-hand Gettysburg testimony ever assembled. Within those papers, among thousands of detailed military accounts, there are passages where veterans describe a mounted figure on the battlefield whom they could not subsequently identify. A figure in clothing that seemed wrong for 1863, pointing, directing, appearing at moments of crisis. Some soldiers, in their accounts, identified the figure as George Washington. The Confederate testimony adds a layer that the Union accounts alone cannot provide. Separate from the Little Round Top accounts, soldiers in Confederate units engaged at other points on the battlefield described their own spectral encounter. A mounted figure visible in positions no living Union officer occupied at that moment, observing their lines from ground that should have been empty. The Confederate accounts were gathered in the post-war period by Southern regimental historians and by veterans organizations that published collected memoirs. They did not describe the same figure as the Union soldiers. They described a different apparition in a different location behaving differently. 2 armies, 2 separate inexplicable witnesses, 1 battlefield. The psychological literature on combat hallucination is substantial and serious. Extreme physiological stress, sleep deprivation, dehydration, the perceptual distortion produced by artillery concussion, and the psychological weight of mortal danger are all capable of producing vivid perceptual experiences that bear no relationship to external reality. The soldiers at Gettysburg had been marching and fighting for days before the battle began. They were in states of extreme physical depletion by July 2nd. Any honest analysis of the Gettysburg accounts must acknowledge that the conditions for stress-induced perceptual anomaly were fully present on that battlefield. What the stress hallucination explanation struggles to accommodate is Chamberlain. He was not describing a battlefield vision in the moment of crisis. He was writing years later in the composed retrospective language of a scholar and former governor, and he was choosing his words with the deliberateness of a man who understood rhetoric. When Chamberlain, in his writings about Little Round Top, used language that implied a presence without naming it directly, he was making a careful rhetorical choice. He was neither claiming a supernatural event nor denying one. He was doing something that an intellectually honest man does when he has experienced something that does not fit his existing categories. He was leaving the question open. The Batchelder interviews are the evidentiary anchor for the Gettysburg accounts. Batchelder was meticulous. He walked the battlefield with veterans, matching their verbal accounts to the physical terrain. He cross-referenced testimony from men who had been in different positions, checking for consistency. He was not collecting ghost stories. He was creating a historical record, and he was troubled enough by certain recurring elements in that record to note them specifically rather than edit them out. The accounts of the unidentified mounted figure appear in his papers as anomalies within a larger, otherwise coherent body of military testimony. Gettysburg has been studied more intensively than almost any other battle in American history. The terrain has been surveyed, the troop movements mapped to the minute, the casualty figures analyzed by regiment and by hour. The historical scholarship is vast and rigorous. Within that vast and rigorous scholarship, The accounts of the spectral figure at Little Round Top and the Confederate vision at the opposite end of the battlefield persist, unincorporated, unexplained, noted, but never resolved. Chamberlain spent the rest of his life as one of the most celebrated military heroes in American history, lionized, interviewed, and exhaustively documented. He never fully explained what he had sensed on that hill. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain held the line at Little Round Top with a bayonet charge that may have saved the Union Army on its worst day. He was a man of extraordinary courage and documented intelligence, a man who chose his words with scholarly precision for the rest of his long life. He wrote about almost everything. And about the one thing he saw or felt on that hill that did not fit his understanding of the world, he wrote only in the careful, oblique language of a man who knows what he experienced, cannot explain it, and will not dishonor it with a comfortable lie. Number 4. The Battle of Agincourt. On October 25th, 1415, the feast day of Saints Crispin and Crispian, King Henry IV of England deployed an army of approximately 6,000 exhausted soldiers across a muddy field near the village of Azincourt in northern France. Facing them were French forces estimated by contemporary sources at between 12,000 and 36,000 men, a disparity so enormous that when the French herald came to Henry before the battle to offer him terms, the English king rejected them with a deliberateness that bordered on the otherworldly. The battle that followed lasted roughly 3 hours. When it was over, the French army lay devastated, and the accounts written by men who had been on both sides of the field describe something that no military historian has ever satisfactorily explained. The royal chaplain who wrote the Gesta Henrici Quinti, one of the most reliable near eyewitness accounts of any medieval battle, composed his text within a year of the engagement, while participants were alive and identifiable. He had been present at the baggage train during the battle, close enough to observe the engagement and to gather immediate testimony from soldiers who had fought in it. His account is distinguished by its specificity, its knowledge of military detail, and its obvious effort to record accurately rather than to glorify. When he describes a celestial light visible over the English lines during the fighting, he does so in the careful, measured language of a man who is reporting what witnesses told him, not composing hagiography. The France of 1415 was a kingdom under profound strain. The 100 Years' War had been grinding across the country for decades. The French nobility, which provided the core of the armored cavalry that formed the most powerful military force in medieval Europe, had suffered catastrophic defeats at Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356. Those battles had damaged French military prestige, but by 1415, a generation had passed and confidence had returned. The French force at Agincourt was assembled with the expectation of total victory. They had the numbers, they had the armor, they had the cavalry. The English were exhausted, depleted by dysentery, and far from home. Nothing suggested the outcome that occurred. The English army was built around its longbowmen, approximately 5,000 archers, who could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute at ranges of up to 200 meters. Henry positioned them on the flanks of a narrow field, with stakes planted before them to break cavalry charges. The French had seen this tactic and its effects at Crécy and Poitiers, and their commanders debated furiously how to counter it. What happened when the battle began has been reconstructed by generations of military historians, but one element consistently resists reconstruction. At a critical moment in the engagement, the French cavalry, which substantially outnumbered anything the English could field on horseback, failed to advance in a way that no purely tactical analysis has ever fully explained. Jean de Wavrin was a Burgundian chronicler who collected accounts of the battle with the particular intensity of a man with personal stakes in the record. His father had fought on the French side at Agincourt and had died there. Wavrin, in the years after the battle, gathered testimony from French survivors, men who had been in the cavalry formations, men who had watched the engagement from positions of command. His chronicle is one of the most important French perspective sources for the battle. When he describes the cavalry's inexplicable hesitation, he is drawing on the testimony of the men who were inside that hesitation, who experienced from within the strange paralysis that descended on the most powerful element of the French army at its moment of commitment. The English chronicles describe a vision of St. George above the English lines. This is not surprising. St. George was England's patron saint, and it would have been culturally and theologically unusual if English soldiers had not invoked him and attributed their victory to his presence. The French chronicles do not describe a vision of St. George. What they describe is something experienced from within the French formations, a disruption in the cavalry's will to advance that the surviving knights themselves could not account for in purely tactical or physical terms. The ground was difficult, the English stakes were a hazard, but the French outnumbered the English in cavalry so massively that a determined charge, accepting losses, should have overwhelmed the English position before the longbowmen could be decisive. Enguerrand de Monstrelet, another French chronicler writing within years of the battle, confirms the central military fact that puzzles historians. The French cavalry never effectively charged. The men were there. The horses were there. The tactical situation, despite the difficulties, was not hopeless. And yet, at the moment when the charge should have come, something held the French back in a way that their own commanders and survivors recorded with bewilderment rather than tactical explanation. Monstrelet, like Wavrin, offers no satisfying reason for the failure. He records the facts and leaves the cause unanswered, which is the honest response of a chronicler who does not know. The historians who have studied Agincourt most rigorously, including Anne Curry, whose analysis of the original muster rolls and campaign documents revised the accepted casualty figures significantly, have focused primarily on the tactical and logistical factors of the battle. The muddy field that hampered armored movement, the narrow front that compressed the French formation, the English archers' rate of fire and their accuracy. These factors are real and they matter. But they do not, in the judgment of the battle's most detailed analysts, fully account for the paralysis of the French cavalry at the decisive moment, or for the scale of the English victory against odds that should have been prohibitive. The ceramic phantom persists because the documentary foundation beneath it is genuinely solid. The Gesta Henrici Quinti survives in manuscript. Jean de Wavrin's chronicle survives. Monstrelet survives. These are not oral traditions passed down through generations of retelling and embellishment. They are documents written by named individuals within years of the battle, drawing on testimony from participants who are still alive, and they agree on the central anomaly. Something about what happened at Agincourt on October 25th, 1415, exceeded the explanatory capacity of the men who were there. Jean de Wavrin's father died on that muddy field. His son spent years collecting the testimony of the survivors, men who had ridden in the cavalry that failed, men who had watched from the French command positions as something went wrong that they could not name. When Wavrin was done, when he had gathered every account he could find from every surviving witness he could reach, the question of what had broken the French cavalry at Agincourt remained exactly where it had been before he started, without an answer, without even the outline of one that satisfied the men who had been there. Number 3. The Battle of Los Angeles. At 3:16 in the morning on February 25th, 1942, the air raid sirens of Los Angeles screamed to life. A blackout order went into effect across the city immediately, plunging the largest metropolitan area on the American West Coast into darkness. Then the anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Battery after battery along the coast and across the city began firing into the sky above Los Angeles, and they kept firing for the better part of an hour. By the time the guns fell silent, 1,240 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition had been expended. 3 civilians were dead, killed by heart attacks and car accidents during the blackout. And whatever the guns had been firing at had not been shot down, because nothing, according to both the United States government and the government of Japan, had been there. This was not a rumor. This was not a weather observation misidentified by a nervous sentry. The guns of the United States Army opened fire over the second largest city in America 10 weeks after Pearl Harbor, when the fear of Japanese attack on the American mainland was not paranoia, but a rationally grounded military concern. The Japanese had shelled the California coast at Goleta just the previous day. The context was one of genuine military alertness, and the men operating the anti-aircraft batteries were soldiers under command, firing on orders from officers who believed they had an identified target. The Los Angeles Times photograph taken at the moment of maximum firing, showing searchlight beams converging on a central point in the sky, was published the following morning and has been examined ever since. The United States Army Air Forces had established coastal defense networks along the Pacific coast following the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Anti-aircraft batteries were positioned throughout the Los Angeles area, manned by personnel of the Western Defense Command under Lieutenant General John D. Witt. Radar systems monitored the approaches to the coast. Observation posts were staffed around the clock. The military establishment in the Los Angeles region in February 1942 was, by any reasonable measure, alert, organized, and equipped to respond to incoming aircraft. The response to whatever appeared in the sky over Los Angeles on the morning of February 25th was not a panicked reaction by poorly trained personnel. It was a coordinated military engagement. The immediate aftermath produced two official American explanations that directly contradicted each other. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox held a press conference on February 25th and stated flatly that the incident was a false alarm caused by war nerves and possibly weather balloons. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, speaking the same day, said that somewhere between 1 and 5 Japanese planes had been over the city, possibly launched from a submarine or from a Japanese ship offshore. These two senior American officials, both speaking with governmental authority, gave the press completely incompatible accounts of the same event on the same day. The contradiction was never resolved in any official communication that followed. The Japanese government's position on the Battle of Los Angeles was stated clearly in the post-war period when American investigators examined captured Imperial Japanese military records and conducted interviews with Japanese military personnel. Japan had no aircraft over Los Angeles on the night of February 24th to 25th, 1942. No aircraft had been launched from any Japanese ship or submarine in proximity to the California coast on that date. No Japanese military operation targeting Los Angeles was planned, authorized, or executed. This was not an evasive or qualified denial. It was a straightforward statement from a defeated government that had every reason to be honest in post-war accounting, supported by the examination of its actual military records. In 1983, the United States Office of Air Force History conducted a formal reassessment of the incident and concluded that the most probable explanation was a weather balloon or balloons that had drifted over the city and triggered the initial alert, after which a combination of searchlights, anti-aircraft fire, and the extreme anxiety of a population 10 weeks past Pearl Harbor produced a self-sustaining episode of misidentification. This is a coherent explanation, and it addresses the mechanical question of what the gun crews thought they were firing at. A weather balloon caught in searchlight beams, trailing debris after the first round struck it, could produce a visual impression that spread through the observation network and justified continued fire. What the weather balloon explanation cannot account for is the Los Angeles Times photograph. The image, taken at the height of the engagement on the morning of February 25th, shows between 10 and 15 searchlight beams converging from different angles on a single central point in the sky above the city. The object or phenomenon at the convergence point of those beams has a defined shape. It is not diffuse or irregular in the manner of a balloon caught in searchlights. Multiple photographic analysts who have examined the original print over the decades since its publication have noted that the convergence pattern of the beams is consistent with the gun crews tracking a fixed, coherent object at a consistent altitude, not reacting to debris drifting at variable heights. The disparity between the official explanations is itself an anomaly. When two senior cabinet officials give directly contradictory accounts of a significant military incident on the same day, and when no subsequent official communication reconciles those accounts, the information architecture around the event has failed in a way that demands explanation. Knox and Stimson were not speaking carelessly. They were making formal public statements about a matter of active military concern. The fact that their accounts were irreconcilable and remained so suggests that neither man had access to a clear and agreed-upon account of what had actually occurred over Los Angeles that morning. 3 civilians died. 1,740 rounds were fired. The Japanese military says it had nothing there. The American government produced two mutually exclusive explanations. The photograph shows searchlights converging on something with a defined shape, and the United States Army, under operational command using calibrated anti-aircraft weapons designed to track and destroy fast-moving aircraft, fired 1,740 rounds at whatever it was and did not bring it down. That last fact, perhaps more than any other, is the one that the weather balloon explanation finds hardest to accommodate. Weather balloons, when struck by anti-aircraft rounds, do not remain aloft and coherent for the duration of an hour-long engagement. What was the Army of the United States shooting at over Los Angeles on February 25, 1942? The Secretary of the Navy said nothing. The Secretary of War said Japanese planes. The Japanese government said no Japanese planes. The Air Force history said a weather balloon. The photograph suggests something with a fixed shape and consistent altitude. The guns fired 1,940 rounds and reported no confirmed kill. And somewhere in the gap between those irreconcilable facts, whatever was in the sky above the second largest city in America that morning continues 80 years later to resist any explanation that accounts for all the evidence at once. Number 2. The Battle of Ypres, the bowmen of the trenches. In the autumn of 1914, in the fields and waterways of Belgian Flanders around the ancient city of Ypres, the British Expeditionary Force and the Imperial German Army were completing the process of destroying each other's capacity for maneuver and settling into the system of opposing trenches that would define the Western Front for the next 4 years. The First Battle of Ypres, which ran from October 19th to November 22nd, 1914, cost the British approximately 58,000 casualties and the Germans approximately 130,000. Numbers so catastrophic that they effectively ended the professional British Army that had gone to war in August. In the exhausted silence that followed, along the frozen trench lines of the Ypres salient, something happened that neither army could explain and that both armies described. British soldiers, in letters home and in conversations recorded by medical personnel and chaplains working in the forward areas, began reporting figures in no man's land. Not German soldiers, not shapes produced by wire and mist, though the Flanders winter produced both in abundance. Figures that appeared solid, visible in daylight as well as darkness, standing or moving in the churned ground between the opposing trench lines. Medieval in appearance, carrying bows. Multiple soldiers in separate units, with no communication between them, describe the same basic apparition. Archers standing in no man's land, facing the German positions. Some reported seeing them fire. Some reported that in the sectors where the figures appeared, the German lines fell inexplicably quiet. The War of 1914 was documented on an industrial scale unprecedented in the history of armed conflict. The British Army maintained a vast, bureaucratic apparatus of paperwork, from casualty returns to operational orders to the personal diaries that officers were encouraged to keep and that ranged from terse military notation to detailed literary composition. The regimental system, which kept men from the same towns and regions together in the same units, created communities of witnesses who knew each other and who reported to chaplains, medical officers, and military investigators with varying degrees of informality. The volume of documentation produced by the British Expeditionary Force in 1914 is staggering. Within that documentation, the Ypres accounts of unexplained figures in no man's land appear with a consistency that attracted formal attention. On September 29, 1914, a writer named Arthur Machen published a short story called The Bowmen in the London Evening News. The story described phantom archers from the Battle of Agincourt appearing at the Battle of Mons to assist the retreating British forces. Machen was explicit that it was fiction, a supernatural tale he had composed in response to the war's early disasters, drawing on his long-standing interest in mystical traditions. Within weeks of its publication, something extraordinary began to happen. Letters started arriving at the Evening News from soldiers and from nurses and chaplains who had spoken to soldiers, asserting that what Machen had described as fiction had actually occurred, not at Mons, at Ypres. And they insisted their experiences predated Machen's story. The pre-publication question is the crux of the entire mystery. Maetion's story appeared on September 29th, 1914. The First Battle of Ypres did not begin until October 19th, 1914, which means that the Ypres accounts cannot have been inspired by Machen because the battle had not yet happened when he published. But some of the soldier accounts referenced experiences during the retreat from Mons in late August and early September 1914, which do overlap with Machen's publication window. Brigadier General John Charteris, serving as Chief of Intelligence at British General Headquarters under Field Marshal Sir John French, investigated the reports and noted in his diary that the accounts were sufficiently consistent and sufficiently widespread to merit serious attention from military intelligence. The German dimension of the Ypres accounts is simultaneously the most compelling and the most contested element. Reports circulated attributed to British intelligence officers processing German prisoner interrogations that German soldiers in the Ypres sector had submitted accounts to their own military authorities describing figures in no man's land. The German military censorship apparatus in 1914 was thorough and systematic, processing and filing all outgoing soldier correspondence. If German soldiers had written home about the bowmen, those letters would have been read, assessed, and archived. The claim that such letters existed, referencing figures in no man's land matching the British descriptions, was reported by several British investigators. The letters themselves have not been independently produced and verified. Ralph Shirley, editor of the Occult Review, conducted one of the more methodical investigations of the Ypres accounts, corresponding with soldiers and their families and attempting to establish chronologies that would confirm or deny the pre-Machen timeline. His investigation, published in 1915, concluded that at least some of the accounts appeared to predate knowledge of Machen's story, but acknowledged that the evidentiary chain was compromised by the impossibility of establishing precise dates for informal soldier conversations in the field. The Society for Psychical Research, which had been systematically collecting and evaluating anomalous experience reports since 1882, also examined the accounts, with investigators noting both the consistency of the core phenomenon across independent sources and the significant problems with establishing a clean, evidential record. Machen himself spent years insisting his story was pure fiction and growing increasingly frustrated with the way it had been absorbed into a mythology he had not intended to create. He repeatedly denied that his story was based on any real account and denied that the subsequent soldier testimonies represented genuine paranormal events. His denials, however, created their own interpretive problem. If Machen's story was the origin of the entire legend, it had to have reached the forward trenches of the Ypres salient by some means and been absorbed into the testimony of men who were under fire and had no access to London newspapers in a time frame of days to weeks. The mechanics of that transmission in the conditions of October 1914 at Ypres are not straightforward. Nurse Phyllis Campbell published collected testimonies from wounded soldiers she had treated, asserting that multiple men had described the bowmen to her independently before Machen's story could have reached them. The Society for Psychical Research subsequently expressed reservations about Campbell's reliability as a collector and interpreter of testimony. Her accounts are therefore marked as disputed within the evidential record. What is not disputed is that the accounts existed, were widespread, were collected by multiple independent investigators operating in different contexts, and were consistent enough in their core details across those independent collections to resist explanation as pure fabrication or pure Machen-inspired confabulation. Something was reported in the fields around Ypres in the autumn and winter of 1914. Whether it was a genuine anomalous phenomenon, a mass perceptual experience produced by the extremity of the conditions, a cultural myth that spread through exhausted soldiers, the British fought a disciplined rearguard action through the afternoon, their rifle fire so rapid and accurate that German commanders initially reported facing machine guns where there were none. Then the British retreated, marching south through the Belgian night, exhausted and outnumbered and carrying their dead and wounded with them. And in the days that followed, the strangest reports in the history of modern warfare began to circulate through both armies. The accounts did not come from one regiment or one sector of the front. They came from multiple British units across the breadth of the retreat, from soldiers who had no communication with each other, collected by officers, chaplains, nurses, and eventually by intelligence personnel who who were not looking for ghost stories and who found the consistency of the accounts troubling in a way that professional military men found difficult to articulate and impossible to ignore. British soldiers described figures appearing between the retreating British columns and the pursuing German forces, angelic figures, or mounted warriors, or a line of ancient bowmen, depending on the account, that seemed to stand between the two armies in the dust and darkness of the August retreat, holding the German advance at moments when it should have overwhelmed the exhausted British rearguard. The British Expeditionary Force of August 1914 was the most professional military force the United Kingdom had ever deployed. It was small by European standards, but it was composed of long-service regulars, men who had spent years in uniform and who had seen action in multiple colonial campaigns. These were not easily frightened men. They were not, as a professional culture, inclined toward mystical interpretation of military events. The regiment was their world, their chaplain was a practical man of the cloth, and their officers were products of the late Victorian military tradition that valued stoicism and practical judgment above sentiment. When soldiers of this background begin reporting, consistently and independently, that they have seen something that cannot be explained, the testimony carries a particular weight. Private Robert Cleaver of the 1st Cheshire Regiment did not write an anonymous letter to a newspaper. He signed his name to a sworn affidavit, a formal legal document describing what he had witnessed during the retreat from Mons. His account describes figures visible to him in the field, figures that stood between the British and German positions, and that he could not identify as any human presence from either army. The affidavit is documented in Harold Begbie's investigation on the side of the Angels, published in 1915, and in the records of subsequent investigations into the phenomenon. Private Cleaver put his name to his account at a time when all the events he described had just occurred, when every military and social convention of his world would have counseled silence if he had any doubt about what he had seen. General John Charteris served as Chief of Intelligence to Field Marshal Douglas Haig, commanding Fourth Corps during the retreat. Charteris was not a credulous man. His professional function was the critical assessment of information, the identification of reliable sources, and the rejection of unreliable ones. In his diary, Charteris recorded that accounts of the angelic figures at Mons had reached GHQ in sufficient numbers and from sufficiently reliable sources to require formal attention. His diary entry has been questioned by some historians who note that diaries can be revised or embellished after the fact, and the possibility of retrospective interpolation cannot be entirely excluded. What cannot be excluded is that Charteris, a senior intelligence officer with significant professional investment in accuracy, placed the accounts within his personal record of the campaign. The German prisoner accounts are the element of the Mons story that most directly addresses the question at the heart of this entire video. The phenomenon at Mons was not witnessed by the British alone. British intelligence, their findings, while carefully hedged, noted that the core of the Mons accounts displayed a degree of independent convergence that their standard analytical framework found difficult to dismiss. Arthur Machen's story, The Bowman, published on September 29, 1914, created an interpretive crisis for the Mons accounts that has never been fully resolved. Machen described phantom archers at Mons. Soldiers subsequently claimed their experiences predated his story. Machen insisted his fiction was pure invention. Investigators attempted to establish timelines. The overlap between Machen's fiction and the soldiers' testimony made clean separation of the two nearly impossible after a certain point. But the Mons accounts predate the Bowman's publication. They were already in circulation in the British Army before Machen put his pen to paper, a fact that Charteris' diary, if taken at face value, and the earliest chaplain and nursing records support. Machen named something that was already being described. He did not create it. The consequences of Mons rippled outward in ways that make the phenomenon's reality or unreality more than an antiquarian question. The British retreat was halted. The German advance, which by every military calculation should have enveloped and destroyed the BEF, stalled in ways that German commanders subsequently struggled to account for. The miracle of the Marne, which followed in September 1914 and turned the German offensive back from Paris, depended on the BEF's survival during the retreat. If the British Army had been destroyed at Mons, or in the retreat's aftermath, as the strategic mathematics suggested it should have been, the course of the First World War and therefore of the 20th century would have been fundamentally different. Whatever delayed the German pursuit of the retreating British in those August days in 1914 had consequences of civilizational scale. Private Cleaver signed his name to what he saw. The German prisoners gave their accounts under interrogation in a foreign language to officers of the army that had just been trying to kill them with nothing to gain and credibility to lose. The Society for Psychical Research filed its report. General Charteris made his diary entry. Harold Begbie gathered his testimonies. And the angels of Mons, whatever they were, wherever they came from, stood in the dust of a Belgian August between two armies, and soldiers on both sides of the guns looked out across the ground that was about to consume a generation, and saw them and wrote it down, and signed their names, and the explanation has not arrived in the 110 years since. Some things stand between the armies of the world and refuse to be explained away, and the ground at Mons, where the professional British army made its first stand and something stood with it, is one of those places that history cannot quite close the file on. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.